Hello, my name is Lindsay Wiggins, and welcome to the first part of my presentation on case study research. Case studies widen the parameters within which we view learning to read. They remind us that the methods and time schedules by which these skills are conventionally taught are not necessarily conditions for learning them. And this quote came from Bissix, and it was straight from our book. And then another quote before we dive in, Lucy Calkins said, "All our students are case studies." And I thought that was a good one to keep in mind as we move forward. All right, so to define a case study is a research design that is non-experimental and descriptive. A critical feature of this study is that it's a study of a bounded system that could be a child, classroom, teacher, etc. A common misconception is that a case study is only focused on one student, and while case studies can focus on one student, they can also expand to those other items such as the classroom or the teacher even. Case studies do not offer information regarding the causality of teaching practices and effects on learning. They do provide information about the dimensions and dynamics of the classroom learning environment. One misconception to bring up before we move on is that a case study is not equal to a single subject experimental design. And I know that Aubrey mentioned this in her presentation as well. A case study provides insight into the who that is being studied. This type of study can focus on an individual, but also a group, program, or phenomenon. Single subject experimental designs consider the relationship between an independent variable and a dependent variable. And this type of research design focuses on one individual and one intervention at a time. All right, so a case study consists of 4 characteristics. First of all, case studies are particularistic, which means that they are centered around a particular person, program, or phenomenon. Case studies are descriptive in that the researcher is gathering a rich description of the subject. Case studies are heuristic. The study enriches the reader's understanding. And case studies are inductive, which means that the data drives the understandings from the case studies. So to sum up the case study characteristics, a case study is an intensive, holistic description and analysis of a single entity, phenomenon, or social unit. So case studies can have 3 purposes, and I will walk through each of those 3. And with each purpose, I have included an exemplar example of a study that has been done. So the first purpose of case studies are that they are intrinsic, meaning that the research is seeking to better understand a case because it is interesting and not necessarily to contribute to theory building. An exemplar example of this type of purpose is when a researcher explored the multiple uses of religious and secular texts in the school, home, and community of Yemeni high school girls. So the goal of this study was to describe their use of literacy within the multiple settings and explore that, not necessarily to build a theory. The second purpose of case studies are that they are instrumental, meaning that the researcher is looking for insight into an issue. An exemplar example of this type of study, of this type of purpose, is where a study focused on an African American mother and daughter that lived in poverty and were able to have success with literacy expectations in their home and community, but not in school. So the researchers were really digging into this and looking for insight into why the literacy expectations were not being met in school and why that particular place was having the issue. The third purpose of case study research is a collective case study, and this is where the researcher is investigating a number of cases to study a group, event, phenomenon, etc. An exemplar study of this type of purpose is where this study focused on multiple teachers and the way that they supported the learning of African American students. So this was collective because the study was focusing on those multiple teachers and not just a single teacher. All right, so here is a brief history of case study in our country. This type of research design had a lack of status after World War II, and this was due to the popularity of behaviorist psychology and large-scale experimental studies. Those large-scale studies were thought to be more rigorous, and at that time they were valued more. Many researchers began to use this type of case study research as they were dissatisfied with the limited answers received from large study stanines, and this was happening particularly in the last 30 years. The majority of case studies in literacy research are focused on early literacy and instruction. While this is the majority, it does not mean that case studies in literacy research can't go outside of early literacy. There are 4 standards listed for quality case study research design. The first is that the researcher use multiple sources of evidence, and this can include observations, interviews, collection of artifacts and/or documents. So a quality case study research will use more than one of these sources. The second standard for quality is that there be a chain of evidence present, and that chain of evidence should be presented in a linear fashion to explain how the evidence contributed to the conclusions of the study. The third standard for quality in case study research is that the study be reviewed by key informants before publishing, and this is just to ensure that any misconceptions are addressed before moving to publishing. The final standard for quality, and this is a very important standard, is that the researcher carefully considers ethical issues such as reporting personal biases. If personal biases are not addressed and the researcher is not aware of them, it can affect the results of the study. So it is important to be aware of those personal biases and keep them in check as the study goes forward. There are, like any research design, advantages and limitations to the case study design. Some advantages to case studies are that they provide an in-depth insight into the subject of the study. It considers more than just data and test scores, and it is often applicable to real-life situations, and readers can relate case studies to their own classrooms and experiences. Case studies are limited by their inability to apply results to a wider population, so you cannot take a case study with an individual and easily apply it to a wider group. Case studies are also difficult to replicate and are very time-consuming. And again, this is where the personal biases come in. If researchers' personal feelings may affect the result if the researcher is unaware of those biases. All right, so I've included a couple more examples of case study research. So the first example was from Wolf and Heath, and these are both found in our book in chapter 2. Wolf and Heath studied Wolf's 2 daughters, and within this case, the readers learned about the connections from text to life and life to text. So the researchers detailed how the girls' literacy-rich home had contributed to the girls using rich vocabulary from the books. So they would often make life connections to the words that they were encountering in books. And The researchers then were comparing the girls' learning experience at home and how they adapted to school learning. And what happened was that Wolf and Heath criticized schools in the way that they saw low-level questions taking away from the children's real literature experiences. So what they were seeing was where in the home the two girls were asking these deep questions and having great conversation about the vocabulary they were finding. What they were seeing in school was that the girls were more focused on finding the one correct answer in the book that would answer the low-level thinking questions that they were being asked. Another example is from Dineshi and Dyson, where they actually used previous data to argue against the school practice of using a one-size-fits-all literacy curriculum. And they supported their argument with previous case study data that children need the time and space to learn about or through language in a way that they choose or enables them to utilize what they already know. So those are just a couple more examples to add to the ones that we've already talked about. And then I would like to end with this quote that case studies are complex because they are built around multiple data sources that must be analyzed into themes or patterns. And my question for you is, as a classroom teacher, what is something that you would be interested in exploring via case study research? This could be a particular student, a group, program, phenomenon, etc. that you see within your classroom that you are interested in knowing more about. All right. Thank you so much, guys. I appreciate you taking the time to listen. Bye.